Welcome back to the Canadian Science Policy Conference being held in Calgary at the TELUS Spark Science Centre. We mentioned to you earlier on that this conference has attracted people from all over the world, from the Netherlands, the UK, the US as well, and from all across Canada. Right now, though, we're going to get a chance to chat with a gentleman who's come quite a ways to be here. You've come from Edinburgh.
I have.
In Scotland, Professor Iain Gillespie. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
My first encounter with you was sitting in front of you while you were talking about Science Policy 101 in the very first event of this conference. Perhaps you can tell us, for the people watching that may not all be aware of what's going on, the basics of science policy.
Well, the basics of science policy...
You have a minute. Okay.
This is a bit like, I spent a long time working in the UK central government for a range of ministers, and normally it was a 30-second pitch, so I've used my 30 seconds.
Telling me.
Exactly. Science policy is about creating the environment that you do science and drive innovation in. Sometimes it's deliberate, sometimes it's emergent. It's things like decisions around funding of science, decisions around uptake, decisions around regulation, decisions around indirect and direct funding. It's what government does to enable the science enterprise to happen, deliberately or accidentally.
Well, one of the things I've picked up is that Canada does not have a definitive science policy. What do you think about that claim?
I think that's a little bit overstated. Canada does have a science policy. As I said, science policy is the environment that you have in your country for science to be done. And Canada has a pretty supportive, actually a very supportive environment for science. Now, it may be that Canada spends less time thinking, designing and pulling the levers of that policy in a centralised way compared to some countries. But the net product of this is Canada still hits well above their weight and is very, very effective in global terms in delivering really excellent science. The policies are.
So why do you think that we're having a conference like this talking about the necessity of having a science policy?
Well, I think this is partly because science policy has become more and more a vogue subject over the last few years since the economic crash. There's more and more pressure around the world, not just in Canada, everywhere else too, to see that public investment in science delivers public benefits. And I mean wealth, I mean health, I mean better environments, all of the social benefits that we want to see coming out of the science base. And there's a vision that can be better delivered by having more deliberative policy. So more of an interest in science policy, more of an interest in getting the levers right to translate that curiosity into good societal outcomes. I don't think there's any surprise, and it's not particularly unusual that Canada should be looking at how to do that better.
How do we differ from the UK?
Well, the UK's thought a lot about science policy for a long time, and it's had a chief scientist to the cabinet who has had some degree of power since the early 1990s. I think it was 1992, the UK came out with a white paper, which was the first real policy white paper on science of the modern generation, called Realising Our Potential. And since then, the Office of Science and Technology, then the Government Office for Science, backed up with a very senior scientist appointed to advise the cabinet with a network of chief scientists around departments, has really tried their best to deliver effective scientific advice to ministers in their decision making. And Canada has experimented with that chief scientist role, but done that in a, shall we say, less prolonged way than the UK has.
One of the things that you spoke about yesterday is even just when it comes to science, a process can be up to, throwing it out, 30 years. It's a lengthy process to go from research and development to actually putting the product out there. Whereas politicians tend to think on much shorter cycles, and I might even say, more of a selfish cycle because they're looking to get reelected as well. So that, there's that or their party reelected. There's that aspect to it as well. How do you combine the two and make them work?
Well, if I look at some of the good practice that's around, or what I see as good practice, that's already a judgment of mine, I'd say that there's a combination of two approaches, the long term and the short term. The long term is around driving policy for science, policy for investment in science, policy for converting that science into the wealth, the health, the environmental gains that I talked about. And then there's a complement to that, which is how you take decisions, policy decisions, based on good scientific advice. So how do you use science in policy rather than how do you develop policy for science? And this is one of the things, of course, that we talked about a lot in the Science Policy 101 workshop yesterday, which is these two kind of inward-facing perspective on driving science and outward-facing perspective on how science helps drive sensible decision-making. And good practice, where it exists, and the UK has done not too badly in this. Other countries like Japan, Korea, Finland have also done really quite good things, is to have advice which helps politicians in the very short term take decisions which they're faced with today. And if I think about my time when I was in the Chief Scientist's office in the UK, the kinds of things that we dealt with were the cloning of Dolly the sheep. I remember very clearly we had 4 hours notice before Nature published the paper to come up with advice to our ministers. And that was really, really immediate. The minister said, well, what the heck do I do? And good scientific advice provided to help good decision making is a very, very important role in that continuum of, we hope, good policy, sensible decision making. And that, I think, you have, it's harder to get here in Canada. You have to kind of look around for, well, who do I ask for advice on subject X or subject Y?
Well, and that brings us to one of the topics that was talked about as well, and that is instead of having science and policymakers going like this, and then, like you say, 4 hours before they announce Dolly the sheep, oh, let's talk. You know, you've got to keep those channels of communications going much sooner than that.
Yeah, well, we certainly we learned in the UK many lessons from that. I think the Royal Society and the Director of Science Policy for the Royal Society is here at the conference. The Royal Society is the UK's Science Academy. I think they learned a huge amount from this, that scientists need to help the policymakers keep up with the advances that are happening. The problem is, as a policymaker or even as a policy advisor, is, as you've rightly said, you're continually reacting to the political reality of the day-to-day jostling in the House, the day-to-day demands on that politician. And it gets very hard for you as an advisor to really be aware of what's happening in the long term in the science community. And having the academies create a bridge between the science policy advisor and the real science community is really been something which has only happened in the last 10 or 15 years or so.
One of the things, obviously, that's going to be changing the way things are done, it's globalization and the way, you know, whatever happens overseas, we can get over here immediately. That's one of the topics that you're talking about as well while you're here at the conference. Well,
one of my real interests in globalization is there's a central conundrum here. It's a central conundrum which we all face on globalization, which is we see much more science being done. We see much more collaborative science being done, not just within countries, but between countries. We see much more effective science being done with this collaboration across borders. But that means that you're sharing your, if you like, your family jewels. As you develop ideas, as you develop propositions which might lead to wealth creation, essentially you're sharing in that enterprise. You're having a much more open approach to the generation of knowledge. And so one of the balancing acts that needs to be done is to allow scientists, allow countries to participate in that much more open development of knowledge, a more efficient translation of cash into science, but still allow the capture of knowledge so that you can turn the science into cash. It's really, really easy to turn money into science. It's a heck of a lot harder to turn science into money.
Right. Last question for you. You come to a conference like this. What do you think of? This is the 4th year that they've had this conference. What do you think of this event?
Well, the thing that's impressed me most of all so far has been the participation of young people here in the conference. It's, I go to far too many conferences around the world where it's grey, middle-aged men and ties that try to make them look interesting.
Okay. You can only go so far.
You can only go so far,
Okay.
exactly, especially on camera.
Yeah.
But I think having young people here is so exciting. One of the real challenges that we face is fostering and helping build the aspiration of our young people who come into science and science policy. And I think as a reflection on the past, we've sometimes pushed that aspiration down and moved our young people to a notion of, well, mediocrity is enough. We just have to do enough, and that's the expectation of us is low. And here we've been hearing a lot of young people really challenging and saying, well, we should be doing more, and we want to do more, and how can you help us really deliver the promise of science and help policymakers realise some of these benefits for society. And that, for me, is one of the most exciting things about the conference so far.
Wonderful. Iain, thank you very much for joining us.
It's been a real pleasure.
We've been chatting with Professor Iain Gillespie from the University of Edinburgh.